let's just say hindsight is 2020, okay? Had Kamala Harris won, Joe Biden would have been the greatest patriot in the history of the republic, and her campaign staff would have been brilliant. But there is a reality, right? And we have to deal with that reality. You suggest the party needs a complete overhaul. What are we talking about here?
Well, here's the reality. We have a new era. We need new advisors.
But what is the new era?
The new era is that we need to simplify the way we communicate with people. We need to understand that we meet them where they are, not where we think they should be. We shouldn't be telling them what they should care about. We should focus on what they do care about and what we can do for them and communicate those things. I also think that our consulting class, you got to look at that and figure out whether these people can succeed in this era. I think a lot of those people are Clinton era people, and otherwise, you may have to reevaluate those things. But what we have doesn't work.
But what about, do you think, Brendan, this idea that we are in a new era? It did seem like Kamala Harris's team was trying to move somewhere new and different. They certainly spent a lot of money, for example, on social media. They had a lot of young people on their staff. What, as you look at it, is the lesson from this loss?
Well, I'll start by saying I think it's good that the party is at least grappling. Not every party grapples with what happened in the way that they should. Like when we lost in 2012, I was working on the Romney campaign. We went and talked about all the things we need to do, outreach to minorities, and we just completely ignored all of it. So I'll be interested to see whether they actually take anything from here. I think what Michael's talking about is right.
But remember when Reince Priebus wanted to remake the party?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then, well, so what does the future hold? We don't know. We went after Mitt Romney, we went and nominated Donald Trump. I don't think anybody kind of saw that coming as the direction we needed to head into to win the White House again. But I do think that it is good that Democrats are grappling with the fact that a lot of people think that they talk down to them. A lot of people think that they're arrogant. A lot of people think that they're a party of scolds. And that's just not inviting.
But that's not different from 2016, is it?
It may not be, but the Democrats have lived in an era where it's been very easy to just be against Donald Trump for a long time. And that sort of unified them. It unified a lot of people. And you didn't really have to worry about whether what you were doing was working very well, because just sort of if your identity is being against Donald Trump, that's pretty simple. And now that that's gone, maybe, I don't think it's gone. They're still going to be against Donald Trump. But at least they can recognize, hey, maybe we should take a look at ourselves a little bit. And I don't know how long they're going to be doing that, but at least for the moment they are. And I think that's good.
Do they need to have a face of the opposition? Do they need to have a leader or find one pretty quickly? Some people say if it turns out that Hakeem Jeffries becomes the Speaker of the House, that puts him in a certain position. If you want to look way ahead to 2028, there are people who may be positioned, lots of governors, right? Gavin Newsom, Gretchen Whitmer, Josh Shapiro. Pete Buttigieg is somebody who went on Fox a lot, who went into places some other Democrats would not go. What does the Democratic Party do? Who do they look to for where this change happens and how?
Well, the good news is we have this long bench of talent. And obviously I'm in the tank here, but I think Leader Jeffries really embodies everything that we stand for as a party, both in terms of fighting for working people, but also working across the aisle when it makes sense. I mean, he's passed a number of bipartisan bills in Congress, and I think that speaks to the way that he operates. He has a good relationship.
How does someone like him up his profile? If that's seriously a potential, how does he up his profile so that people look at him and say, oh, yeah, he's somebody I see as a leader?
Well, he's not interested in upping his profile. He's interested in the work.
Don't you have to up your profile?
Well, he's living, obviously, in the maybe not the immediate shadow, but of Nancy Pelosi, who was a very good foil for Donald Trump. And, yeah, like your job in the minority, he's going to be the minority leader. I'm pretty confident in that. Your job is to defeat the majority. And he does need to be pretty aggressive in doing that. And whether he's up to that, he's a pretty talented guy, I think so. And Chuck Schumer the same way, very political animals. And they're going to be, I think, going head-to-head with Donald Trump. But
no one's asking Chuck Schumer to run for president.
No, of course not. And nobody, well, I guess some people were asking Paul Ryan to run for president, but or no one was asking Nancy Pelosi to run for president. But you are the opposition, and your job is to fight it out for the next 2 years in Congress, and then you can worry about who your president. I think it's a waste of time to try to figure out who your next standard bearer in terms of the presidency is going to be. The fight is going to be governing in Congress, and Jeffries and Schumer, the spotlight's going to be on them.
Is it also, though, about the infrastructure of the party and the people, as you say, who they choose to run campaigns? I mean, let's not kid ourselves. 2026 is going to come very fast.
Sure, because we have to think about the way, again, that we communicate. In this era, you should be talking about the economy and what you're going to do for people, not about sort of the fight for democracy or calling Donald Trump a fascist. No one knows what that word means, first of all. All right, so let's back up. Let's focus on kitchen table pocketbook issues. That is our way back to the majority. That is our way back to the White House, not these other fringe issues that we keep talking about They don't mean anything to most Americans.
One of the most interesting things I read in the last 24 hours or so reporting is that it was Barron Trump, who you don't see very often, although he was on the stage the other night with his mom and dad, putting out the push within the campaign to go on these podcasts, these male-dominated podcasts, right? And again, where you go is always critically important. But back to your point, what you say, how you say it, meeting people where they live, ultimately, if we're going to look at methods of delivering the message, none of that matters if it's not the right message.
Kamala Harris ran a very good traditional campaign.
Yes.
She did the right interview. She did 60 Minutes, all of those things. Donald Trump went on these podcasts and he did these appearances. And while Democrats were saying he's like a Nazi, he's a fascist, he's having a regular conversation with people. And some of these people just say, he's not a fascist. He's just a guy talking about sports on a podcast. How bad can he actually be? And that's how he takes the edge off of it. That's how he can say whatever crazy thing he wants to say on Monday, and on Tuesday relate to people in a way that takes the edge off. And it works for him. I don't know that everybody can do that, but he's able to talk like a real person. Not every politician can talk like a real person. I think a lot of people saw Kamala Harris as a politician, and that came back to bite her.
Who on the Democratic side can talk like that?
Well, Hakeem Jeffries has that ability. It's true. But also, I think Wes Moore is incredibly talented.
He is.
And can do this and has done this. And I actually agree with Brendan in terms of, this is where Democrats should be. Again, placing TV ads is not an effective way to engage young voters. We should be going to these podcasts and having real conversations, not running through talking points, but have a conversation like a human being, like Donald Trump did. That is sort of the way we should be moving forward here. We should be rethinking about the way that we communicate and those platforms that we use.
And I don't want to overstate that Donald Trump ran a great campaign or was a great candidate. I just think a lot of what happened, there's a lot of reasons why Trump won and Harris lost. I think, the economy and all of those things. I just think that people looked at this and said, I can relate to him in some weird ways. They can relate to him. And Harris, they had a hard time seeing past the image of a politician who held different views 4 years ago. And now I'm supposed to believe she holds these views. She's very, scripted by the book. There's something to learn there. There's a lot to not learn from Donald Trump. I don't want to overstate that he's an ideal candidate. He was a bad candidate in a lot of ways. But the relatability, I think, is what we've seen here, is one of the most important things in politics, and it gets overlooked a lot.
Well, relatability, yes, but is discipline dead?
He's got no discipline.
Well, that's what I'm saying. I mean, you had one of the most disciplined presidential candidates. I mean, 107, 108 days is an extraordinary feat to build a campaign, stay basically on message, although there are people who say, in the end, she should never have gone back to going after Donald Trump. She should have stuck to the message. I don't want to, look back, but is there a lesson to be had? Why didn't the Democrats learn that you don't win by letting Donald Trump take the lead, allowing him to control the news cycle, or going forward, anybody to control the news cycle? If it turns out J.D. Vance is the next leader of the MAGA movement, he will do what Donald Trump has done, which is try to control that cycle day after day.
Yeah, I mean, I think Democrats need fresh blood. They need more aggressive, diverse advisors in the room. We need state school kids, for instance, who are incredibly smart. We need fewer Ivy League kids making these decisions. We need people who have been sort of living regular lives that most of us actually live. That's a good way back. And again, we're doing the work in a lot of ways, but we're not communicating that in an effective way.